Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's presentation and roundtable discussion on finding Black stories in archival court records. I'm Deirdre Skaggs. I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Discovery in the University of Kentucky Libraries, and I'm Director of the Wendell H. Ford Public Policy Research Center. We are honored to have United States Circuit Court Judge Robert Wilkins here this morning to give a talk on his remarkable research into his ancestry. Thank you, Judge Wilkins, for being here today and sharing your story with us. I also want to extend my appreciation to our partners, the Commonwealth for Black Studies, the J.D. Rosenberg College of Law, and the Honorable John G. Hayburn II Initiative for Excellence in the Federal Judiciary. UK Libraries is grateful to call them co-sponsors in bringing Judge Wilkins to campus this week. As a reminder, tomorrow at 4 p.m. in the Law School building, Judge Wilkins will be in conversation with Stephen Reed, who is General Counsel for Bright Spring Health Services, former U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Kentucky, former chair of the UK Board of Trustees, and Rosenberg College of Law alumnus. I know that that will also be a great event, and I hope to see many of you all there tomorrow. So today, we will hear a talk from Judge Wilkins on his family history research. After his talk, a panel of experts will join him to discuss that research and put it into further context. Our speakers today will be Dr. Vanessa Holden, Associate Professor of History here at UK, Reinette Jones, UK Librarian and co-founder of the notable Kentucky African American Database, and Rusty Heckaman, State Archivist for the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives. I will hold off on fuller introductions of our speakers until we get to the roundtable, and for now, I just want to thank you all so much for being here today. All right. So now to introduce our guest of honor, the Honorable Robert L. Wilkins was appointed to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit on January 15, 2014. A native of Muncie, Indiana, he obtained a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology in 1986 and a Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School in 1989. Following law school, Judge Wilkins served as a law clerk to the Honorable Earl Gilliam of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of California. In 1990, he joined the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, where he served first as staff attorney and then as the special litigation chief. In 2002, he joined the law firm of Venable LLP as a partner, handling white-collar defense, intellectual property, and complex civil litigation matters. During his tenure with the Public Defender Service and in private practice, Judge Wilkins served as the lead plaintiff in Wilkins et al. Versus State of Maryland, a landmark civil rights lawsuit that inspired nationwide legislative and executive reform of police stop and search practices and the collection of data regarding those practices. Judge Wilkins also played a key role in the establishment of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is amazing if you haven't been there, serving as the chairman of the site and building committee of the museum and the selection of its location. On December 27, 2010, Judge Wilkins was appointed United States District Judge for the District of Columbia, where he served until his appointment to the DC Circuit. So, without further ado, Judge Wilkins, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm going to set a timer because I can talk forever and you don't want that. So I am going to set a timer so that I don't go over. So I'm here, it's really a pleasure to be here this morning for lots of different reasons that I'll get to as I speak. But I do have Kentucky roots, and you're going to hear about those in my talk, even though I'm, of course, born and bred in Muncie, Indiana. The roots go back to Kentucky on my maternal side. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that and frame this in the conversation of a journey, my personal family's journey from slave to citizen. And so without further ado, let's get to the story. When I was in law school, I became interested in genealogy. And a friend who was quite adept at it said, well, you should start by interviewing, the oldest relatives you have living, your grandparents, and trying to find out everything that you can from them and getting any records that they have and documents and photos, etc. And so that's what I did. I started with my maternal grandmother, and she had a family Bible that had been given to her by her grandmother. And this was a page at the beginning of that Bible that recorded births, and there were also recorded deaths and marriages. And so the very first line, there is a Lewis Richard Salisbury, and this is shows it a little bit blown up, and it shows him born September 25th, 1842. So that was as far back as this Bible went, and Lewis Richard Salisbury was my great-great-great-grandfather. Was able to find a death certificate for him and learned that his parents' names were Edith and David Salisbury. But I didn't really know much of anything about them. I knew that he had lived in Kentucky, in Owensboro, and that's where he lived at the time of his death. But I didn't know anything about Edith and David Salisbury. And so over the course of the last 35 years, I've been searching to find more about them. And what you're going to hear this morning is a little bit about what I found. So the Salisbury name comes from a man named Thomas Salisbury, who I would later learn owned Lewis Richard Salisbury. And he owned Lewis Richard Salisbury because he owned Lewis's mother, Edie Salisbury, at the time that Edie gave birth to Lewis Richard in 1842. David Salisbury, my fourth great-grandfather, Lewis Richard's father, was also enslaved, but he was not owned by Thomas Salisbury. He was owned by a neighboring family. And this was in Muhlenberg County, Kentucky. County seat is Greenville, in western Kentucky. Now, this document is a document that when I went through the archives and court records, I wanted to find out everything I could about Thomas Salisbury. And this is a indentured servitude contract that Thomas Salisbury entered into, where he took a young man named Samuel Lamar into his care as an indentured servant at 7 years old to be indentured to him until he turned 21. And Samuel and his sister were basically put into indentured servitude when their father died. The mother remarried, but for whatever reason, the court saw fit to indenture these two children. And so this young man who happened to be white, Samuel Lamar, was indentured to Thomas Salisbury. And I know this is hard to read, but this talks about the obligations that Thomas Salisbury had to young Samuel Lamar, and among them were to teach him to read and to write and arithmetic, to the rule of threes. I didn't know what that was. I looked that up, and it turns out that it's like basic algebra, so that if you have two knowns, you can solve for a third unknown. So, 2x plus y equals 10, and if you know if x is 2 and y is 4, whatever, you solve for the third thing. So he had to educate Samuel Lamar. He had to teach him the art of farming, had to provide food and clothing for him. And then when he reached 21, he had to essentially give him a stipend and a suit of clothes and send him on his way. I thought that was interesting because it's a lot different than the obligations that Thomas Salisbury would have to black children like Lewis Richard Salisbury in his care. This is another record that I found involving Thomas Salisbury, and it is him appointed to be the administrator of his brother-in-law's estate. So Thomas was married to a woman named Rebecca, and Rebecca had lots of brothers and sisters, and one of Rebecca's sisters was married to a man named David Robinson, and when David Robinson died, he did not leave a will, and the court appointed Thomas Salisbury as the executor to try to settle this estate. And so these are probate records that I found from that. And Thomas Salisbury is trying to figure out what to do. You know, one of the first things that would happen is they would take an inventory of the property of the deceased person. And that meant counting the slaves. It also meant counting the cattle and hogs and tools and everything else, land, if they were owed any money, those promissory notes, and then to see kind of how all of this was going to shake out. You know, if he had any debts, were slaves going to have to be sold off to pay those debts, and then what was left over to give to the wife as her dower interest, or to children or other heirs. And so here they took an inventory of David Robertson's property, and you actually see here 3 lines down, you see Ida, who is shown at 16 years old, worth $400. That is Edie Salisbury. That is my 4th great-grandmother. So this is the earliest record I have of this direct ancestor of mine. She's not owned by Thomas Salisbury now. She is owned by David Robertson. I said Robinson earlier, I meant Robertson. She's worth $400. And something interesting, you see there's a young girl named Rispa who is 14 years old, valued at $300. So they're 2 years apart. One is valued $100 more than the other. Why is that, I wondered? Well, as I look further, I realized the reason. It's because Edie, or Ida, she went by Ida, Edie, Edith, in various different records, she was pregnant. So that unborn child was worth $100. That's why she was valued at $400, while 14-year-old Rispa was valued at $300. Another thing that's interesting about this is that while they were trying to figure out what was going to be the ultimate disposition of all of the property, including the slaves, they would basically make yearly kind of annual provisions for them. So someone might get the slave for 1 year, and then at the end of the year it would be reassessed. And someone could essentially hire the slave or rent the slave for a year. And here they were trying to figure out what was going to happen to them, and it says that they went on to divide them by ticket. And so it basically appears that they put names in a hat, and then they pulled names out of a hat to figure out who was going to get or be responsible for the various slaves. So contrast kind of how Samuel Lamar, the 7-year-old white boy who was indentured to Thomas Salisbury, was treated and dealt with my fourth great-grandmother and the other enslaved people, where basically they were given to people based on pulling names out of a hat. This is a blow-up of that language. So, eventually, the court approves a disposition of the property of David Robertson, and Edie has a child whose name is Alexander. And you see here, this is the final disposition, and the court notes that they're going to divide the Negroes amongst the heirs of David Robertson. And Edie went to one of Robertson's daughters, who had married a man named Anselm Bell. So Anselm Bell and his wife got Edie, who's now 17 years old, and she was worth $350. So she wasn't worth as much because she had the baby, and the baby was given to somebody else. Alexander was now 1 1/4 years old, and he and another baby or toddler who was 1 1/2 years old, they were together valued at $275, and they went to a different daughter. Alexander was classified in court records and census records later as mulatto. So Edie was never classified as mulatto. So what does that tell you? Alexander's father was a white man. I don't know who. Edie was 16 years old, enslaved, bore a child by a white man. What do you think the circumstances of that were? It was probably not of her own choice. So my fourth great-grandmother had that child and was raped as a teenager by a white man, and that's Alexander. So this woman, Hannah, who was also owned by David Robertson, was 38 years old, and she went to a different daughter, Margaret Robertson, who would later marry and move to Arkansas and take Hannah with her. I believe that Hannah is my great-great-great-great, 5 greats, I lost count, grandmother. I believe that Hannah is Edie's mother, but I don't know that, and I can't prove it. But just based on her age being about 21 years older than Edie, and the likelihood that Hannah had been owned by the Robertson family for a long time, and probably was the mother of several of those slaves. But, you know, I can't prove that with the research that I've done yet. So, a couple of years later, in 1830, Anselm Bell, who inherited Edie, he owed Thomas Salisbury some money. He owed him $289.50. And in order to resolve that debt he had with Thomas Salisbury, he bargained, sold, and delivered unto said Salisbury a Negro woman slave named Edie. So Edie went from David Robertson's estate to his daughter, who married Anselm Bell. Anselm Bell owned Thomas Salisbury money to settle that. He delivers Edie to Thomas Salisbury. So that's the story of how my fourth great-grandmother came to be owned by Thomas Salisbury. I had to figure all of that out by going through these court records that are invaluable for this type of research. So, Thomas Salisbury owns Edie, and under the law of slavery, he owns any children that she bears while he owns her. And so she bears several children with David, who is my fourth great-grandfather, who's enslaved, to another family. And so he owns all of those children, and then he owns some other slaves that he acquired otherwise. And he drafts a will in 1844 where he says, well, look, he and his wife do not have any children that survived to adulthood. His wife came from a big family. Her family was the David Robertson. Her sister had been married to David Robertson. She had like 6 or 7 other siblings right there in Muhlenberg County. So there were whole bunches of nieces and nephews, but they didn't have any direct descendants. So Thomas Salisbury, I believe that he and his wife were Quakers. At least I believe that they were married in a Quaker church. And the Quakers were generally opposed to slavery, the denomination, but there were individual Quakers who owned slaves. So maybe out of a sense of his, religion, or maybe just his own kind of sense of moral obligation, and maybe also because he didn't have any children, he decides in his will that he's going to free his slaves. So he assumes that he is going to predecease his wife, and so he says, upon my death, 2 of my slaves, Noah and Betsy, are to be freed immediately, and he gives their son, Jefferson, to them as their slave to take care of them until they die, and then Jefferson can be free once his parents die. And then the rest, he says, if they're over 25 at the time so the rest, he says, are to serve his wife until his wife dies, and then when his wife dies, the rest can be free if they're over the age of 25. If they're under the age of 25, he says that his friend William Rumsey, who had been a U.S. congressman from the state of Kentucky, representing the state of Kentucky in Washington, and a prominent lawyer there in Muhlenberg County, he said that essentially they should be given to Edward Rumsey, did I say William Rumsey? Edward Rumsey, until they reached the age of 25, and then Rumsey was to emancipate them. So that was kind of the way that he did things, and then he said that once his wife died, he had 550 acres of land that was to be divided up and given to all of his former slaves. So that's what this will says over the course of several pages. This is just one page of it. Now, this will, so you might be asking yourself, how do I really know that these are my descendants? That Edie is my 4th great-grandmother? Well, this is the will. You can see, I, Thomas Salisbury, do make and declare, and then this my will and testament, and then he talks about he had previously done a will where he said my slaves were to be free at the decease of myself and my wife, and then he thought that he needed to redo the will because he didn't think that he had made the wisest decision with respect to his young slaves. So I think in his prior will, he might have said that the young slaves, even the ones under the age of 25, should be free immediately. And then I think he rethought that and thought that no, they should go to this Edward Rumsey until they reach the age of 25 to be freed. And then this is the next page. And then he's talking about he's going to bequeathed to Edward Rumsey the use of these slaves until they reach the age of 25. And then he starts listing some of the ones that are under the age of 25, and he lists one of them, Lewis Richardson, born September 25th, 1842. Well, remember my grandmother's Bible? Lewis Richard Salisbury, born September 25th, 1842. Now, how did I find this? I found this because I was researching Kentucky history and Kentucky slavery history, and I came across an entry on the Notable Kentucky African Americans database by the wonderful Reinette Jones over here. And there was an entry about a Salisbury Free Negro settlement. And I thought, my family name is Salisbury. I wonder if I'm related to these people. And the website entry just described that this man, Thomas Salisbury, had left 550 acres to his former slaves, and they created this Salisbury Free Negro settlement. And it had a couple of citations there, and one of them was a master's thesis by a woman named Celeste Stanton. So I went to the Library of Congress, which houses pretty much every master's thesis that's been written in the whole country, and I requested that. It was in hard copy, not in digital format. And I'm sitting in the reading room of the Library of Congress in Washington, and they bring out a copy of this thesis, and I'm reading through, and the thesis is telling the story of, these former slaves of Thomas Salisbury and the story of their freedom, and it has a copy of that will. And I'm reading the will, and I see that one of the slaves is Lewis Richard, with a born September 25th, 1842, and that date was seared into my brain. It had been seared into my brain for 30 years from where I was trying to learn more about him. And I realized that this was my story, and I almost fell out of my chair right there in the reading room of the Library of Congress. But I would not have known any of this without Reinette Jones. So thank you for that. So this is the will. And Thomas Salisbury wrote in his will that he was naming Edward Rumsey as the person to be responsible for administering the estate and to basically holding in safeguard the slaves that were under the age of 25. And you might wonder, well, why did he do that? Well, the law of emancipation in Kentucky at that time was that a slave owner could emancipate their slaves, but a court had to be satisfied, A, that the slave owner paid off all of their debts before the slaves could be freed, because they might need to be sold to pay a debt, right? And then secondly, that the slaves would be able to take care of themselves, that they'd be able to work, that they wouldn't be kind of a drain on the state, they wouldn't need the equivalent of welfare or anything like that, they'd stay out of trouble. And so a lot of times that was a challenge if the slaves were young. There might be somebody who would challenge the will and say, that person can't be freed, they're not going to be able to take care of themselves. So that might be one reason why Thomas Salisbury wrote his will that way. But at any rate, he said in his will that he had discussed all of this with Edward Rumsey, and Rumsey had said that he wasn't sure that he wanted this responsibility. And so Rumsey, he said that Rumsey would have 6 months to decide whether to take on the responsibility or not. And this is Rumsey saying that he's thought about this, and that he even entertained the idea of taking on the responsibility so that it could be of some avail to Mrs. Salisbury's poorer relations. But then he decided that he wouldn't do that because Thomas Salisbury's wishes were that all of these slaves were to be freed. And so he just declined the responsibility altogether. But he essentially said out loud here, as best as I can tell, that he thought about kind of like not implementing the wishes of Thomas Salisbury, but helping out the poorer nieces and nephews who were probably clamoring to get this property and to get these slaves. But he didn't do it. So another notable thing happened, and I need to pick up the pace. I'm going too slow here, so I'm sorry, is that I found another lawsuit involving Thomas Salisbury that was filed in 1847, the year before he died. So he writes his will in 1844, and he's sued in 1847. He dies in 1848. In this lawsuit, and this is what the lawsuit looks like in the Kentucky State Archives, and then this is a close-up of this page. It was filed by Nancy, a woman of color, versus Thomas Salisbury. And essentially what Nancy said was that I'm owned by Thomas Salisbury. My daughter, Mary Jane, is owned by Thomas Salisbury. I'm, I believe, like 47 years old. My daughter is 10 years old. And I'm supposed to be free because when I was a child, I and my mother were owned by a man named John Dowdle, and he said in his will that all of his slaves were to be freed when they reached the age of 31. And her lawsuit basically says, I'm well past 31, I should be free right now. And I had my daughter, Mary Jane, after I reached the age of 31, so she really was born free, but she's lived her entire 10 years enslaved. And Salisbury had acquired Nancy around the same time that he acquired Edie, around 1830, again to settle a debt. So she said that her lawyers wrote Salisbury a letter showing him a copy of this will. John Dowdle lived, I believe it was in Washington County, about 100 miles from Muhlenberg County, and the lawyers had gone there and found the will and presented it to Salisbury and said, you know, Nancy is supposed to be free, and he would not free her. And so they filed this lawsuit. So they had to prove that Nancy was the child mentioned in this will. Dowdle's will said that Jenny, who was about 25 years old, and her daughter, Nancy, who was like 2 years old when he wrote this will in 1804, he said that they were both to be freed when they reached the age of 31, and they were given to one of his daughters. And what had happened is that the daughter and son-in-law sold them to someone who sold them to somebody else, and then they make their hands to Salisbury, who may or may not have known that they were supposed to, that Nancy was supposed to be freed when she reached the age of 31. Right. So they had to prove that Nancy is the same Nancy that was the 2-year-old mentioned in John Dowdle's will. So the way that her lawyers do that is that they take depositions, and they took a deposition of one of David Robertson's nephews, Robert Robertson, whose family came to own Jenny. So that was Nancy's mother. And they asked him, did you ever hear, because Jenny had a son named Abner who was also suing for his freedom under the same theory. He said, Jenny, my mother, and Nancy's mother, she had me after she had turned 31, so I should be free. And so he asked this Robertson whether Abner's mother, Jenny, had ever said that she was supposed to be free. And so this is the questioning. Did you or not ever hear his mother or a Negro woman, Jenny, which your father owned, speak of her right to freedom? Answer, I have heard her say that if she had her rights, she would be free. Next question. Did she or not ever state how she was entitled to her freedom? She never did that I know of. It was only when she got angry that she would speak of her right to liberty. Next question. When she would speak or talk in this way, did it ever excite curiosity in the family's mind as to what she was referring to? Not that I know of. So he basically pretended that ignorance. Oh, she said she had a right to liberty, but we never asked, or we didn't know what she was talking about. We didn't know anything about any will. If you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. So that's how that lawsuit went, but they were able to prove that Jenny was the woman named in the will, the same Jenny, that Nancy was the same young girl in the will, that Abner's mother was this Jenny, and essentially the court rules that they are to be freed, and this is the court order. So Nancy and her daughter, her 10-year-old daughter, are ruled to be free of Thomas Salisbury, but they had to sue to win. Nancy and her daughter sued for the equivalent of back pay, said, we've been held as slaves for, in Nancy's case, it was probably like 16 years, and the daughter, all 10 years of her life. The judge didn't give Nancy a dime. The judge gave the child, I think, $5. But Edie would have seen all of this, right? She would have known about all of this because Nancy's right there on the farm with her. So what do you think Edie is thinking? She knows there's a will that says that when Thomas Salisbury dies in 1848, that she and the others are going to be freed when Mrs. Salisbury dies. But do you think that she might be worried that that may never happen? Nancy was supposed to be freed too in the future, but what happens? People manipulate things. And especially after Edward Rumsey says, I don't really want to have any part of this, right? So I believe that Edie was preparing for the day that Mrs. Salisbury died so that she would be ready. One thing happens in the interim in that Kentucky has a constitutional convention, and this is an article about it, and essentially the convention was called by people who wanted to end slavery. But they, at the convention, can't agree on how to end slavery. Some want to end it immediately, some over a period of time. Some said all the slave masters should be reimbursed for losing their property. Others said no. Some said that all the slaves should go to Africa. This is what this writer said, that there should be a provision for the colonization of free Negroes. So all the emancipated slaves should be sent to Liberia or somewhere else because they didn't want free blacks. So the people who were pro-emancipation couldn't agree, but the people who were against emancipation were in complete agreement. So what happens when you have a divided group against a united group? The united group wins. So the Constitution is amended, but instead of making it easier to emancipate slaves, it's amended to make it harder to emancipate slaves. And it's amended to say that in order for a slave to be emancipated, not only must the slave owner pay off his debts and the slaves must show that they can support themselves, but they have to leave Kentucky in order to be free. And it's a felony for them to remain in Kentucky or to leave Kentucky and return. And so in 1860, when Mrs. Salisbury dies, this is kind of what the country looks like politically. The green states here are the states that in that election voted for Breckinridge, and the red states here are the ones that voted for Lincoln, and then Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia voted for Bell. And then this just shows kind of the state of the country at the beginning of the Civil War, with the border of the Confederacy here in red. And these slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, not part of the Confederacy, but they are slave states. So that's kind of like the political climate in 1860 when Mrs. Salisbury dies. And Edie has to figure out what is she going to do. The law says that she has to leave Kentucky in order to be free and take all of her kids. By that time, she's got about 12 kids. The oldest are in their early 20s, and she's got some as young as like 5. So is she going to take all of them and leave Kentucky? What's she going to do about her husband? He's enslaved, and he's not affected by the will, so they'd have to leave him behind, or he would have to run away with them. And where is she going to go? Because Illinois and Indiana, who are due north of western Kentucky, they don't want free blacks coming. And right after Kentucky amends their constitution that says that blacks have to leave the state to be free, Indiana and Illinois amend their constitutions to say that it's a felony for any free blacks to come into their states. So Edie can't even legally go to there. And most of the other places that she can go require blacks, when they come, to post a bond. They called them peace bonds, to ensure that you're going to work and stay out of trouble. And it might be like $500 a person, which is the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. And where's she going to get that money for her and her 12 kids, right? So she was in a bind as to where she would go. And then if she left, she'd leave this land behind, her share of the 550 acres. So she does what I think any good red-blooded American would do. She hires a lawyer and she sues. She sues in Muhlenberg County Circuit Court. This is the record found in the state archives. And this is the first page. And you see her, and she lists, she's the first plaintiff, and then they list all the others, including Lewis Richard. And they basically say, look, our late master wrote his will in 1844. It was published in probate court when he died in 1848. You changed your constitution in 1850. So whatever changes you made shouldn't apply to us. We're grandfathered. She might have said we're grandmothered. And so she said, we want to be able to stay in Kentucky, we want to be free, and we want to inherit our fair share of this land. And that's filed in 1860. In 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, she wins. This is a court order where the judge says he does a judge order and decree that the slaves are entitled to their freedom, their right to freedom having accrued by the will of Thomas Salisbury before the adoption of the new present Constitution. They have the right to remain in the state of Kentucky, are not compelled to leave, and then they can inherit this land. So that's how the Salisbury Free Negro Settlement comes about. In 1866, after the end of the Civil War, and the 13th Amendment is passed, Kentucky passes a law to recognize black marriages. And this is the law passed in February 14th, 1866. David Salisbury and Edie Salisbury went before a justice of the peace or a clerk about 6 weeks later in March of 1866 to say, we've considered ourselves to be married this whole time, now let's make it official, and it was made official. They were one of the first ones in the county to do that. And then in the 1870 census, after the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, which provided that all persons born in the United States are citizens, now Edie and David are not just free, but they are citizens of the United States. So the first census that they will be counted as citizens is 1870, and this is them. It's hard to read, but David Salisbury and Edie Salisbury in Muhlenberg County are listed as citizens and landowners because of Edie's lawsuit. That's Edie's headstone. It lists her birth as 1805, but I believe based on these probate records that it's probably 1810, but you know, they were probably just making the best guess they could at the time. This is a house on that property that stood until the 1990s or so, that I think was built right around the early 1900s. So it's possible that Edie lived in this house before she died in 1905, but I'm not sure. But definitely some of her descendants lived in this house. That land is now not owned by anyone in the family anymore. But she had a parcel of about 98 acres that stayed in the family until 2007 or so. So Edie lived from the presidency of James Madison to the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. Don't have any pictures of Edie, but this is Louis Richard Salisbury's daughter, Sally Salisbury. So Edie's granddaughter, my great-great-grandmother, taken in 1957. My mother grew up with, she called her Grandma Sally. It was her great-grandmother. This is another picture of Grandma Sally. Sally had a daughter, Lula. This is her, I think, around the time she graduated from high school in Owensboro. She graduated from high school and got a teacher's certificate. She and Grandma Sally moved to Muncie, Indiana in 1920. And that's how the family gets to Indiana. Lula has a daughter, Marcella. That's my grandmother. That's my mother, and that's me. And that's me introducing them to then Senator Obama when he was running for president in 2008. I went to law school with Barack and Michelle. And so when he came to Muncie to speak at Ball State as he was running, I flew home to Muncie so that I'd be able to introduce them to the man who would become president of the United States. This is when he appointed me to the Court of Appeals. He nominated me in 2013. This is me with my family then. So think about the arc of this journey. We started with the first document with Edie on a piece of paper, 16 years old, pregnant with a child of a white man, valued at $400. $100 of her value was that baby that she was carrying. Not a citizen, no rights, and the story ending with me being appointed to a court that some call the second highest court in the land by the first black president of the United States.
Thank you so much. That was just such an amazing story. I don't really have words to express it, but also, Reinette, librarians and archivists change lives. Thank you. All right, so I invite our speakers to go ahead and come up and grab a mic, and while you all are getting situated, I just want to let you know there is a small exhibit on the other side of this great hall to my right. There are some historical legal materials from our collections. They are primarily documents from county circuit courts related to enslaved Kentuckians, including depositions and even a jury verdict. Please be sure to check it out when you can. There's also a QR code where you can access Edie Salisbury's case file from the Muhlenberg Circuit Court. You can download that complete PDF to your device. So I am going to introduce our speakers. I'm going to start with Reinette since she is furthest to my right. I'm just introducing, you're fine. Oh, I have to wait a second. Barry says to stop. Thank you. All right, so furthest to my right, we have Reinette Jones. She is a University of Kentucky professor, librarian, and co-founder of the notable Kentucky African Americans database. Currently, Reinette is a research and reference librarian in the Special Collections Research Center. She is also an affiliate faculty member with the UK African American and Africana Studies Research Program. Reinette and Dr. Holden are also affiliates of the Commonwealth Institute of Black Studies. In 2003, Reinette and former UK librarian Rob Aiken co-founded the notable Kentucky African American database. In 2009, the American Library Association recognized the NKAA with the Rusa Gale Cengage Learning Award of Excellence in Reference and Adult Library Services. The database is 100% supported by UK libraries. New entries and updates are added to this database every week. And this resource gets about 500,000 hits each year from users in Kentucky, throughout the entire United States, and international users for many countries. We also have Vanessa Holden. Dr. Holden is an associate professor of history and the director of African American and Africana Studies here at the University of Kentucky. She is also the director of the Central Kentucky Slavery Initiative. Dr. Holden's book, Surviving Southampton, African American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community, published by the University of Illinois Press, won the 2021 James Broussard's Best First Book Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Her writing has been published in Slavery and Abolition, a journal of slave and post-slave studies, Perspectives on History, Process, a blog for American history, and the Rumpus. Dr. Holden serves as a faculty advisor on several public history and digital humanities projects, including Freedom on the Move and the Digital Access Project. Her current research focuses on slavery and enslaved peoples in Kentucky. Rusty Heckaman is the state archivist and director of the Archives and Records Management Division of the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives. He manages the archival collections of the state of Kentucky, over 119,000 cubic feet of original records, 70,000 rolls of microfilm, and growing terabytes of digital files. The collection is made up of material from local, state, and judicial records that capture the history of the Commonwealth's governance and the interactions of its people with our government. Originally from Indiana, Rusty is a graduate of Indiana University with a Master's of Library and Information Science. And his career has encompassed a variety of archival settings, including municipality and state government, private corporate archives, and nonprofit advocacy organizations. All right, thank you all so much for participating in this roundtable today. We will have somewhere around 30 minutes for our speakers to address the moderated questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions at the end. But I do invite any of you to respond to each other and just have a conversation and see where it naturally leads. So just to get us started, whomever would like to respond with the story that we just heard, is there something that particularly stands out to you, whether it's about Edie Salisbury, the research process, or anything else from his talk?
Oh, we're on. Okay. I think in listening to the presentation and reading the materials that were circulated before your talk today, what strikes me is really the central role of women in your family. And some of this has to do with the law, that children follow the condition of their mothers. So a lot fell to Black women to keep track of, because they're the ones who are going to be able to prove, my child is free because I was made free. But you have a really incredible legacy of women in your family speaking truth to power, taking on, really arduous migration north to Indiana. And I think really taking a moment to realize just how important these women are in your story in a world that says that they're supposed to be the absolute least important people in society. Their courage really set a trajectory for what is pretty outstanding, an outstanding legacy in the present.
No. I'd like to add that so many times we're told that there's no documentation before 1870, but just listening to the way that you were able to go beyond 1870, go back before 1870, and those documents were there. That's amazing. It's amazing that you were able to find it, but it's also amazing because it says those documents exist. They're there. So I think we need to learn a different way of doing research when you're talking about African Americans. And this is a prime example of what can be found in those documents right here in Kentucky. And I'm gonna put a plug in for Kentucky because I always do. Kentucky has some amazing history that is alive, that is well, that is documented, that is in the archives around the state. And please don't ever let anybody undermine what we have done in this state.
Yeah, I'll just echo that particular aspect of what you're talking about, the research process. We have historically relied upon the onus of the researcher to make the discoveries of the items preserved in collections that we work in. And I think there's really great initiatives like your own with the Notable Kentucky African American Database that is making an effort to make those more accessible and discoverable rather than relying upon an individual effort to find these assorted pieces in our collections. So I'm glad you made these discoveries, but it really reflects the work that we need to do as an organization, profession to improve that process for you.
Yeah, like I said, I would have never been able to find any of this without the database and without all the records in the archives and without that thesis, without so many things kind of coming together. It's very difficult, but the records are out there and we need to do whatever we can to preserve them. And to your point, I'd be nothing without, these women, beginning with Edie, pushing and pushing all throughout. And the book that I'm writing about this, the title is going to be Resolute, because that's what Edie was, that's what all of these women were all the way down through my mother. And that's what's been poured into me. So that's all I would say about that.
Great. Reinette, could you give us a little bit more context about the database, how it came about, but also, if you recall, how the entry for the Salisbury Settlement School, how that entry came about, and how you included that dissertation, the master's dissertation that really opened up Judge Wilkins's research.
I actually was not looking for Judge Wilkins' ancestors when that entry came about. You want me to stand up? You want me to talk louder? Yes, Kate Black, I will. Okay, so I was actually looking at, I don't know if he's a relative or not, but Guy Salisbury, Dr. Guy Salisbury in Detroit, he founded the Kerwood Hospital. It was the last African-American hospital in Detroit to close, and there's a strong connection between Kentucky and Detroit, which has to do with the Underground Railroad, but I know we have a time limit and I'm a talker. So that's how that entry came about. I was looking for Dr. Guy Salisbury's beginnings, and someone asked, would you please include this in the database, because there were so many individuals that were tied to that settlement. The NKAA database, it started out as an idea. It took 10 years to get off the ground. It became live in 2003. I convinced Rob Aiken, not 100% honestly. He asked me if I had had permission, and I said, oh, this would be a wonderful idea. I never answered his question, and we did it. Okay, so it's been up and going for since 2003. Let me say this is a patron-driven database. It is the submissions from the community. It is the help of my co-workers, and I have to give a shout out to the law librarians, Bo Stinkin and Tina Brooks, because I'm not a lawyer. I do not know how to do law research, and I wear the heck out of them. I call them all the time, the same as I do with my colleagues here in the library, especially the Med Center, the History Department, Anthropology. I call on people I need to make these entries as effective and as honest as possible. The database is a starting point. When I talk about international users, we have gotten submissions from international users. One of those being Dr. Robert Maxwell Johnson, who was enslaved over on Broadway, went on to become a doctor. He went to school in Scotland, opened his office in England. That entry was submitted from individuals in those countries. So it's not just about Kentucky or Lexington or the well-known counties in Kentucky. As someone said before, we get 500,000 hits, at least 500,000 hits every year. It may be more or less, but until it gets 1 million, I'm just gonna act like, okay, it's 500,000. And that's where we are. But it's a well-used database. I appreciate all the contributions. I get a lot of help from the community, like Sharon Mitchell, who's here, who's retired from Berea, Shay, who's down at the clerk's office, co-worker Laura Hall. It's a joint project. It's not just Reinette and Rob.
And Guy Salisbury is another direct descendant of Edie. I've met over the phone. His son is still living, lives down in Texas now. But yeah, he was probably either a great-grandson or great-great-grandson of Edie, Guy Salisbury was.
Thank you. Rusty, could you share a little bit with us how these court records from Muhlenberg Circuit Court came to KDLA? I mean, these are from the 1860s. You know, how is that similar to how other court records come to KDLA?
Yeah, Kentucky is a little unique in the regard that we have these court cases at all at the state archives. The state archives was founded in the 1960s or so it's not a very old institution in terms of a lot of the old others that we're referring to here in Kentucky. But we're a part of the executive branch, and these records obviously belong to judicial branch, and there's not often a lot of intermingling between us, but this is a rare exception where state archives, in the case of Kentucky, does have judicial records. This particular batch of records from Muhlenberg County came to us in 2004, so they're a fairly recent addition. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. It's a unique relationship in that the physical custody of the records is at the state archives, but the intellectual custody is retained by the Chief Justice in the administrative office of the court. So while it's something that you can access and we make available to researchers at the state archives in our research room, in terms of our control and ability to do certain things with the records, it's a partnership that we have to coordinate with the judicial branch to determine what exactly that entails. And that's pretty accurate to most of the judicial records that we have. They are still incoming, so there's 120 counties in Kentucky. Each of those has its own circuit court. I think there's somewhere between 15 to 20 counties whose circuit court records are not represented at the state archives. There's been a pretty big initiative by the AOC to remedy that within the last few years as a result of the tornado that struck Graves County and destroyed a portion of their courthouse and threatened their records. They've made it a particular point of emphasis to make sure those court records are preserved at the state archives in the future so that circumstances like those don't threaten them.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, Judge Wilkins, could you tell us what it was like being a researcher? Archival research and genealogical research can certainly be frustrating. There's lots of dead ends, and how did you locate the right case, and what other struggles did you have doing the research?
So, I mean, I'm fortunate, you know, I have a job that allows me some flexibility time-wise, you know, I have the resources to be able to, you know, travel back and forth and whatnot. So, you know, it's hard without those sorts of things to do this type of research on a long-term basis. You know, I knew that there was a lawsuit, but I didn't really know much else. And the records, when they were sent from Muhlenberg County to the state, were in kind of a mess. There were some that were indexed, but the vast majority of them were just like in boxes. And there might be records from 1800 in the same box with records from 1860. And they weren't in alphabetical order, not chronological order. So I literally had to go box by box by box trying to find Edie's lawsuit. And there was a group of boxes actually from 1800 to 1860, and that's what I started with. And I went through all of those dozens of boxes over the course of several days and more than one trip to Kentucky. And I couldn't find the lawsuit, and I panicked. And there was a staff member at the archives, a gentleman named Walter Bowman, who took pity on me. And he said, well, let me do some hunting around, and I got an idea where it could possibly be. And he looked in kind of like the next set of boxes, you know, beginning after 1860, and he identified a box, and he said, try there. And Edie's lawsuit was in, or I think he brought me 2 or 3 boxes, but at any rate, one of the boxes that he guessed that it might be in, it was in. But it literally took me days and days and days. But just to hold it in my hand and to see these records and to see, you know, this original piece of paper from, you know, 1860, and to see a page that Edie had signed with an X. And I'm thinking, as I'm holding that with the white gloves on that they have you wear, I'm thinking I'm holding in my hand the same piece of paper that Edie touched, you know, 6 generations back, you know, over 150 years ago. And it was really just kind of chilling. So, you know, it's moments like that that make the, you know, 30-plus year journey worthwhile, you know, when you make those sorts of discoveries.
Thank you. Vanessa, I'll start this directed at you. You mentioned the perseverance of the women in this story, and Judge Wilkins, you know, said the word resolute. How common do you think, like, during this era was it that it was the women who were able to really push through and advocate for themselves in this way?
From the time that Virginia passed a law in the 17th century that children followed the condition of their mother, Black women had to become savvy about the law. There are women in Virginia, there are women in Kentucky for generations that mount freedom suits like this. Enslaved people were very aware of the law, and not just the slave code, but also property law. They had to be very savvy about it. They were well aware of those numbers listed next to their names. They were aware of what enslavers called natural increase, but we would call children. They understood value and the market. They understood the value of their labor. In Kentucky, slave hiring was big business. Enslavers lived on the wages of enslaved people. There were many, many ways to make money on enslaved property. I also think it's important to note that legal culture at the time was different than it is now. Today, folks who don't interface often with law enforcement or don't interface with courts or haven't had to deal with a will because of a death in the family are sort of apathetic to how things move unless they're in the legal realm. In the 19th century, court dates didn't happen every day. They came along at specific times of the month. They were often used as market days. Everybody would come to town. When big cases were being decided, crowds would gather outside of courthouses to make sure whatever was happening inside was in line with what they thought the law should make happen. And there was a sense that keeping the peace or keeping the hierarchy everybody accepted was far, sometimes more important than what the law had to say, depending on what the case was inside. So it's important to note that enslaved people were well aware of this legal culture. They're often around when these things are happening. So yes, your ancestor signed with an X. But she herself had to have savvy about the law and make a legal argument. Well, here's the date. I know when the Constitution went back and was changed, and that doesn't make sense. And so I'm going to marshal this argument. A lot of times the credit is given to the white lawyers in the cases, and sometimes you do have these empathetic figures, but the initial gumption to seek out a lawyer and say, I think I have a case here and here's why, shows us, demonstrates to us the level of savvy and intelligence these women had. Because of the law, it's often women who are involved in cases like this. At the time, paternity was a moving target, but maternity is pretty hard to not be able to nail down. And so women are often at the center of these cases. Black men are also in and out of courts, purchasing their children, trying to purchase their families, trying to go get family members from other states. So it's not that black men are not also actively engaged in trying to free people. It just looks a little bit different because their status doesn't apply to their children.
Rusty, go ahead.
There we go. We're talking a lot about legal research, and like Reinette said, I'm not a legal researcher, but one thing that I have learned dealing with these archival collections is there's an important distinction in Kentucky in particular between the circuit court and the county court, and you've made use of both records and demonstrated here in your research, but if it's a question of property as this originally began, that's going to be a county court jurisdiction. It doesn't elevate to circuit court until a lawsuit is raised. So if you are interested in doing this research yourself, it's something to keep in mind that there's multiple sources that you're going to have to tackle.
Judge Wilkins, so now that you've been a researcher for 30 years, has this affected the way that you look at the records that you're creating in the way that future generations might use those?
That's an interesting question. I mean, as a judge, I am mindful that, the decisions that we make and that what we write, somebody in future generations are going to be reading in part because they may be using it for precedent in a legal case, but also perhaps also as a way to have a window into history, And so I do try to think about that as I'm writing opinions and trying to figure out what to say and how to say it and what kind of context to give with things. You know, I just think in general, just to switch gears a little bit, I had not, even though I was a lawyer, I had not really understood what a wealth of information there could be about African American history in court records. You know, African Americans as individuals there weren't really government records that cared about African Americans as individuals. African Americans were taxed, but those records, they just cared how many head there were, essentially, and maybe ages, because there might be different tax rates based on ages. For the census, same thing. They just needed to know how many of their head there were so that they could multiply it by 3/5 to determine, the apportionment in the House of Representatives and that sort of thing. So most government records didn't really care about black people as individuals. When it mattered was if you were prosecuting a black person, then you'd have to use their name in a court record. Or if a black person was suing, their name would appear. Or if people were fighting over a black person, no, they belong to me, no, they belong to me. Or you sold them to me and you said that they were fine, but they were defective. They got a bad leg and you didn't tell me that when you sold them to me. So, they're suing, those sorts of things. Or these freedom suits. So, a lot of specific information is in these court records that really isn't in any other type of record. And what I fear is that these court records, they're getting old and they are disintegrating and they're not going to last forever. And, in another 50 years, are those records from 1800, are you going to be able to handle them without them falling apart? Are we going to have them scanned by then? So I think that those are questions that we need to try to resolve and bring resources to so that, this history isn't lost. I've just captured the tip of the iceberg about one family. What else is out there? There's thousands of other stories like Edie's in those records.
There's so much here in this story, so I think I'm going to go ahead and open it up for audience questions. I imagine many of you have them. I'm happy to bring you the microphone for the question. We'll do this for the next 10 minutes or so.
Thank you. Hi, can y'all hear me? Judge Wilkins, I just wanted to this can go for anybody, but for your last one about the court records disintegrating, have y'all thought about hiring a conservationist to help keep those records and help preserve them for those 50, 100 years?
I can't answer that. I know what I did was every record that I saw that was vaguely interesting to me, I scanned into my iPad to make a digital copy of them, and then at some point, if I have the requisite permissions to do so, I will donate those digital images to some repository, for people to access. But it's really up to the Rusties of the world to find a way to preserve those.
Yes, so if I was given my druthers and had the resources, we would be doing so. We are taking first steps, I think, in at least getting them all centrally located with the state archives. So I think you've mentioned this before. if before they wind up with us, oftentimes in the courthouses, because the clerks have their own limitations of their resources. These records are stored in basements or not ideal conditions, so at least getting them centrally located and under archival preservation is a positive first step. The challenge of that is though now that they're centrally located, there's 200 plus years worth of records from 120 different counties. So if you multiply that, that's when you get into those 100,000 plus cubic feet of records. So the challenge is dealing with it at a scale of that level. We've made use of grants through federal organizations like the NHPRC to digitize records, starting with some of the oldest court records, the general court, but we're exploring options of doing that with some of the more, not even contemporary, but more records like what we're talking about here from the prior to 1860s.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge. Really appreciate it. I'm a representative of the African American Genealogy Group of Kentucky, the only one so far in Kentucky. I have a question about records, that record search. Did you actually go to look at the county records, the deeds or anything that were in Muhlenberg County that are still there, not just the KDLA records?
Yeah, I started in Muhlenberg County and went through the deed records, you know, the records in the clerk's office, and county clerk, and I looked at court orders and court order books and all of those things there. And I realized, I learned that the court records themselves had been sent to Frankfurt. So I went to Frankfurt, and but I've been to Muhlenberg County, and at their courthouse, their kind of property records, the historical society there, the public library there, and all of that. That's where I kind of started the physical research, and then I went to Frankfurt. But I've also been to Louisville at the Filson, and as well.
All around.
I still have a few more stops I think I need to make. So.
Yeah, I was especially wondering about the actual property deeds that had to do with the land and the descendants that inherited that land, and was there any track back on those? But
Yeah, I traced the land that Edie got, and she deeded it to one of her sons, and then it stayed in that line until 2007. And two sisters at that point sold it. And I actually went, it was Martin Luther King weekend in 2019, and I went to find that parcel, you know, through tax records and other records. I could find the actual parcel, and I drove there. It was just outside of town. And long story short, when I got there, I didn't think I could continue driving my car, because I looked around and saw this land and realized that this is where my ancestors had worked as slaves, and this is the land that, like, Edie fought to be able to inherit from her slave master and stay with her family, stay with her husband. And all of that rush of emotion just kind of washed over me as I'm looking around this land, and I'm just like trembling. So that was my first trip to Muhlenberg County.
okay, and the other one I want to ask is, you mentioned a relative. I'm looking at the migration into Indiana. There was a school teacher, someone became a school teacher. I was wondering if you knew where she was educated. I'm at Berea College, so I have to ask that question.
Well, she went to high school in Owensboro, and I can't remember the high school off the top of my head that she graduated from, and she got a teacher's certificate. I found that in the records. Ironically, when they migrated to Muncie, Muncie didn't hire any blacks as public school teachers until around 1950. So ironically, she couldn't get a teaching job in Muncie, and she worked the rest of her life taking in laundry, like her mother. She and Grandma Sally, that's what they did. They took in laundry. And to me, it's a very sad story, but, you know, she instilled, I think, the importance of education in her daughter, my grandmother. And my grandmother was essentially my first babysitter. You know, she took care of me all growing up. And so I feel like, you know, I got instilled in me the value of education, you know, through, you know, Grandma Lula and Grandma Sally, through my grandmother and my mother. And so I think that's part of their legacy as well.
Hi, my name is Veronica Prim. I'm a graduate student here. And I noticed that you mentioned 2 court cases where these enslaved women were suing for their freedom. And it made me wonder about any specific language that they may have been using in those documents to, you know, make the case that they should be free. Because I know that enslaved people, when they were suing, they were using this language of property, as in, you know, my body is my property and that's why I should be free. So my question to you, Judge Wilkins, is, you know, when you were looking at these documents, is that something that you noticed, this, you know, strategic wording for enslaved women, you know, and their lawyers to gain their freedom?
Yes, I mean, I'm aware of some lawsuits. I think there's a famous one in Massachusetts in the 1700s where people made the argument essentially like, you know, just as a human being, I should be free. You know, I have a right to liberty and whatnot. For the most part, they lost all those suits, you know, because the law said otherwise. But there is a landmark case in Massachusetts, Professor Holden may know more about that than me, where a judge agreed with that reasoning. These lawsuits were all based on, look, you know, I was taken into Indiana, and Indiana is free soil, and I stayed, you know, the requisite amount of time, and under the law, you know, since I stayed there more than 6 months or more than a year or whatever it was, I should be free. Or there's a will that said that I was to be freed in the future when I reached a certain age or whatever. So, you know, the cases that I saw were all about kind of like there was some provision where either a law or a white person who owned me said that under these conditions I was to be free. The arguments about, you know, just I have a right to freedom in general, they weren't going to cut much ice in the courts back then.
And I'll just add, in the case of your ancestors, they're not just suing for freedom. They're also suing for compensation for their labor from the point of time that they were supposed to have been free. And they're asserting, not only do they know that their labor had value, but they're asserting that not only have you held me in a state of bondage, you've profited from my state of bondage. You have profited from this time. You have profited from my labor. Now, ultimately, the judge barely grants, you know, I don't even know, we could call it compensation at $5 nothing for, for a 16-year-old or 10-year-old would have been.
10-year-old for her lifetime of slavery.
Yeah,
and
she
her
probably
mother
would have.
got nothing.
Yeah, she would have begun working or helping her mother work at about the age of 5. Yeah, so ultimately, no, they don't get that compensation. But that's a really important piece that they're saying, not only was I supposed to be free from this point, but you owe me. You owe me back wages.
Yeah, I've never seen, in all of the cases that I've looked at, even when people won their freedom, I've never seen them get any sort of meaningful compensation award. it's usually $0 or like $1 or $5 or something nominal. I think
There's
the
a-
court felt maybe the attitude was, look, you know, be glad you got your freedom, but you're not getting any back pay.
There are actually Kentucky cases with women who did sue and get a fair amount of compensation. Henrietta Wood being one, she got $2,500 from her case, and she had been in Texas and she fought for 15 years to get her freedom. She was re-enslaved after being free.
It can also be challenging to determine the legal arguments, because while the legal cases that we're referring to exist, they're not comprehensive in the idea that there's not a transcript of what was taking place in court. They're fragmented. They're going to be bonds issued for people appearing in court. There's going to be, if you're lucky, depositions taken of the people of the potential testimony that they would have. But it's not going to be the actual legal arguments made typically unless you have had different experience.
Yeah, I mean, legal research back then was a lot different than now, and you can kind of, you know, punch something in and find all the various relevant precedents. But to me, it is amazing that Edie and others had, you know, the wherewithal and the foresight to seek out lawyers and to make these arguments. And you know, I think it shows that they were, as Professor Holden said, you know, they were savvy and sophisticated.
Yeah, and it's super important to remember that often what the records actually are some memory that the clerk had of what had happened in court that day, and maybe, if you're lucky, a collection of depositions, maybe an order ultimately from the court. But there's no court stenographer, you know, recording what's happening verbatim. But from those fragments, we get really rich pieces of the story. And so, to something Reinette said, often the thing that we're met with as African Americans is that, oh, that just can't be known. Oh, there's just no way to know. And the truth is, enslavers weren't particularly embarrassed about being enslavers. They were actually pretty proud of it. Enslaved people were incredibly valuable property that appreciated at a rate that was pretty great for them. And so because of that, there actually are really, really rich records. And in a place like Kentucky, a place that didn't secede from the Union, those records are sometimes in the basements or under some steps in a courthouse, but they're here. And so it's always important to remember that. Embarrassment about slavery or trying to hide stories about slavery didn't happen until generations later. These people were completely happy to state with their full chest that they owned slaves. And so for that reason, ironically, we actually have incredibly good records of enslaved people's experiences.
And there's also the newspapers. I failed to mention this, but if you start your search in the newspapers, you know, newspapers are called the first draft for a lot of people's history. For African Americans, many times it's the only draft. And it will get you started, to give you dates, to tell you where in the courts the case may be and how long it took as well.
Thank you all so much for your time and attention. Thank you, Judge Wilkins, our speakers, our co-sponsors. Let's all give them a round of applause. And just a couple more thank yous as I wrap this up. While I'm standing up here doing the introduction and moderating, all of the work that was done for this was done by Anu Kasarabata, the John G. Hayburn Archivist. Thank you, Anu. I want to thank Martha Hayburn, the founder of the Hayburn Initiative, and your support always means so much, both your time and your friendship, so thank you. Danny Murphy, who's our partner-in-law with the Hayburn Initiative, you are incredible. And behind the scenes, there's lots of people that make this a success. So from UK Libraries, it's Angie Gergley, Shanna Wilbur, Matt Strandmark, and UK Light and Sound. Thank you all. Please check out the exhibit. I'm sure our speakers will be here for a little bit if you have other questions. Thanks again.